Jenny, why don't we get going? So thank you everybody for joining us this morning. It is great to have you here. And for those of you here in Calgary who do like a parade, we will be done in time for you to, I guess, tune in to watch a parade on TV. I don't know what they're doing this year for a virtual parade, but maybe it just won't be dressed up traffic for a change. I'm not sure. Anyway, Jenny, over to you to kick us off.
Of course. And before we get started, as always, it's important to both of us to acknowledge that our campus here in Calgary, SAIT, is situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Today, that encompasses the Indigenous people of the Treaty 7 region, which is Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Northwest Métis homeland. SAIT also acknowledges all the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. This is traditional land and a place where all of us walk in the footprints of the Métis people.
Excellent. Okay, so today, emotional intelligence, emotions at work. When we first started talking about this potential topic today, I said to you, Jenny, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I do this very well. This is the one area I think I struggle in. And you were quick to point out that, well, Craig, actually, that is emotional intelligence. So this could be, this one's a little uncomfortable for me for some reason. But anyway, I'm curious to see how we go here this morning. And if you can always start with something from Harry Potter, which it looks like we are, it's a good way to go, I think. So.
Of course, what more than Harry Potter on a Friday morning? And really, some of you will love Harry Potter, some not so much. But the essence here is some have it, some don't, some will always have it, some will learn it. Emotional intelligence is a very, very broad subject that goes way beyond even just talking about feelings. So we'll put everybody at ease straight away. We're not going to just look at feelings. It probably makes sense for us to define what it is before we lean into this, and then I'll give you, as usual, free rein on our conversation here. Just before we get deeper into this, what is emotional intelligence? If you have a question, that's key to us. So feel free to put that question in the little box at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A, and feel free to use the chat as well. It's been busy already. We would love to comment on all of those. You'll see us looking sideways as we're tracking them, but we won't necessarily be able to say hello to everybody. So emotional intelligence really talks, to how we work with our emotions, and really at its base level being intelligent with that piece. It's inward, as we were saying, Craig, being able to have that self-awareness to say, not quite here right now, but also being aware of other people's emotions too. And that has a knock-on effect in our relationships, how we see ourselves, how we approach other, how we make decisions, and probably most relevant recently, how we deal with stress. And I'm going to throw one more sort of waiver in there. And that is, obviously, this is a course that we teach at SAIT a lot. So there's about 8 of us that deliver this very, very frequently. And this is the model that we use when we're talking about emotional intelligence. And so you can see already the gambit has just stretched big time. And so not are we only talking about how you feel in a certain situation, but there's an awful lot of competencies and skills involved in this. And that's me done.
There you go. So it's an interesting one for me around how do you, as a leader, it doesn't even have to be a leader, how do you know if you're emotionally intelligent? Like that, I've been thinking about that one a lot. How do you even have the slightest clue? Right? IQ is easy. You can go take a test. The test may or may not be easy depending on where you are on the IQ, but that's a different story. But EQ, if you're not taking a test or doing an assessment, how do you know? Like what do you talk about in the class, or what do folks need to think about?
Okay. So, well, first off, you can take a test. That's part of what we do. And it's not a test. Yeah. That's a really key piece in this. We call it an assessment and inventory. And one of the things that people want to do straight away is say, how did I do? Did I get the high score? And really what emotional intelligence is about balance. And so if you want to know without doing that whole piece, you look at yourself. How do you feel about yourself? Okay. You like yourself? The answer is yes. Okay, we're doing all right there. How are your relationships? How do people act, behave, feel when they're around you? Like Craig, if we were working face to face at SAIT, if you walk down the corridor and your team are disappearing, all right, there might be information in there. If you hear the words, watch out, okay, you don't want to go in there for another hour or two. All right, we've got something going on. Doesn't mean that you lack emotional intelligence, but there's a piece playing in that emotional culture. And that's a big piece of workplace culture, is emotional culture. Often gets forgotten, but it's quite prevalent in most cases.
Interesting. Well, I know I've got some of my team on the call this morning. I haven't seen them drop off yet, so that may be a good time for me. But so lots of cues, I guess, you can watch for as a leader. And I think the other side of this that is interesting too, because this whole concept of emotions at work. Why should we even care, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do emotions even have a place in the workplace? They come in without a doubt. We all have daily frustrations. We all have those scenarios that we like. We all look at our calendar and go, that meeting on Thursday is going to suck, right? But why should we care about emotions in the workplace?
Okay. You started off with a right juicy one there. Well,
we've only got so much time, Jenny.
I know. So what we want to do in the past sort of 10, 20 years, what we've really tried to do is look for compliance. We've tried to look for processes that work. And especially, the bigger you get as a company, we want to put that one size fits all intellectual solution on the top. And they don't work. And the reason they don't work is because all these little emotional parts are running around. And so when we look at it that way, when you look at what is the essence of your company? The essence of your company is people. The essence of your team is people. And it would be an awful place to work if we were all the same, all bland, and all had nothing. And so do emotions have a place in the work? Yes, because that's what makes us authentic. That's what makes me. The fact that if we're having a really vibrant conversation and I care deeply, you might see a little bit of emotion in there. Yeah. And I'm okay with that. I'm going to own that. In fact, we'll probably end up talking about that later. But that's part of me. And likewise, too, we forget emotion is data. And so if you're angry about something, I'm sorry, just threw that label on you right there in the morning, but let's say you are. If you're angry about something, most people will sort of run and hide. Okay, we'll give them time. But really, when you look at it, if you're angry about something, anger is a classic sort of blanket emotion. Underneath is an unmet need or an unmet want. There's something missing. People don't get angry for no reason. And so if I can actually stop and think, what's going on here, and listen, then I might hear those cues. I might hear those keys. I probably don't even have to own any of it. It might be something 5 conversations ago. But it's information, it's data. And so it helps us to build those relationships. And when we build those relationships and see each other as real, then we can have those vibrant conversations with perfect candor and still come out the other side all right.
Yeah. Which really raises the question, or in my mind, how good are you at reading other people's emotions, right? If you don't have that skill, or if you're dealing with somebody who does not show emotion very well, right? It becomes there I think is where you really get these situations where you're not quite sure what's going on, and it becomes really tough to unpack. The other side of that too is, sometimes you're not even sure what your own emotion is in a scenario.
Right, those are two different questions.
Absolutely, right? So, the piece around reading other people and reading their emotion, I think, I don't know if you want, I don't know what your thoughts are on that one, but as you were talking there, it's like, yeah, there's something in that.
Okay, so what we're talking about is emotional literacy. And I don't think I have a slide for that, but we can maybe put one in for people afterwards.
Yeah.
So emotional literacy at its simplest, people will operate as mad, sad, glad. And that's a really difficult world to live in, whether you're the person on the other side or you're the person with your emotions, because you can't even read your own emotions. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot is how do you build that emotional vocabulary? And if you don't have that in yourself, you're going to find it really hard to read other people's emotions. So according to Brené Brown, I believe, in her research, and I don't know what the final number is, but a decent emotional literacy is 30 to 40 emotions that we can recognize in ourselves and then recognize in other people.
Wow.
But here's the really key piece is it's not necessarily my job to get it right, to know what you're feeling. I might if I'm very good at it. But it might be the piece where I say, Craig, I'm sensing frustration. Should we dig into this deeper? And you might say, I'm not frustrated, I am X. Well, okay, there we go. Now we've got those two pieces.
Yeah.
And so it's really opening that door to allow people to be where they're at. And then the other key piece, and this wasn't in your question, but I think it's really important, just because you're frustrated doesn't mean I have to be. And that's one of our sort of applied strategies for later on our deck here is, emotions are contagious. And that's great if we're delighted, happy, excited, like take as much of that as you can. But when somebody's angry, frustrated, even sad, interestingly, we will catch that and take that on unless we're prepared for it, in which case we want to just give ourselves that distance. You need to have that emotion. It's all yours, but I don't have to wear it too.
Well, really, that starts to really tie in with the concept of empathy, which I think, let's come back to that one, because I see a couple of questions coming in here. Kay, should we read someone's emotion? I'm afraid of making an assumption and fail to really understand what's going on. And, I think, Jenny, you might have touched on that a little bit.
Yeah.
When you said just the simple phrase of I'm sensing, right? So when I say read, I'm not, and I can appreciate how that may come across as, I don't know, manipulative isn't the right word, but it's not about trying to game the system. It's really just trying to understand what's that expression that you're seeing, what's that body language you're seeing, or the tone that you are or aren't hearing. Sometimes there's a lot in what you're not seeing as well. What thoughts on, should we read someone's emotion?
I think it was Gina who put it into our course delivery as a strategy, and I love it. And it's acknowledge, ask a question. And so when two people have a conversation, there's me, there's you, and then there's this kind of bubble in the middle.
Yeah.
And when we're listening, when we're really paying attention, and we're sort of leaning into empathy a bit here, we'll notice something in that space. And that's reading emotions. And if we're in a good conversation, we can acknowledge that piece. And so when somebody says to me, I caught your eye movement there, or I caught your eyebrows then. Then there's my opportunity. Lots of people, nope, you're not coming in. And that's okay too. That's their choice. So we can sort of acknowledge, ask a question, and then the choice is over to the other person. What I don't think is as successful, in fact, no, I know it's perfectly not successful. Craig, don't be angry. When did anybody ever stop being angry when they were told to be angry? Or even better, calm down. Really?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
That never works at home. I would just say that.
It's not going to work so well. But giving people that space, and that's what empathy is holding space for people to have their emotion. And I know you're not such a fan, but when Brené Brown talks about it, it's not our job to fix it. It's not our job to make it better, but it is our job to simply be there, to give them that space so that they can work through. And I'm dreadful in that space. I'm such a fixer. I just want to turn the light on and make it all better. Life will be great. And you really have to press that pause button sometimes it sucks and we can be there.
Yeah, I am reminded many times at home to just listen once in a while and quit trying to fix it. So that tends to be my default. So, Kay, I hope that answers your question. Allison, I think you touched on that as well. If you don't pose the question or start the dialogue, how would you know what somebody's feeling? It's tough, right? Yeah. It's tough because, most people don't necessarily like to dig in or lean in on an emotional situation or go down that road. And so, as a leader, I think it is really challenging to sometimes step up and say, listen, I think this might be a bit of a tough conversation, but how are you feeling about this?
Yeah.
I get this, right? And sometimes even just phrasing it that way, starting like talk as opposed to just reacting, having that ability to pause and then frame your statement around, this is challenging for me to say as well, but here's what I'm sensing, right? And so I think that's interesting. Couple other things popping up here. Wow, there's lots coming in the chat. Anka, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. What is the best book you recommend on this topic? And also Andrea, second to Anka. No hard feelings. There we go. What websites would you recommend for learning more about emotional intelligence? So, I think we could probably touch on a couple, and if we end up, Jenny, with a list that we want to share as part of the follow-up, we will do that as well.
Yeah, we can do that. When Craig sends you his email afterwards, open it, and in the resources we'll have articles, books, anything that can help. Yeah,
perfect. Mark is posing a question here. People in general are all different with emotions. Is there such a thing as cultural differences as well, where people of different cultures act similarly or differently, but are consistent? So I think that's, if I'm unpacking that question,
that's a big question, and a really relevant one too for our workplaces today. I'm not going to hold myself expert in here at all, but the answer is yes. And so we do have cultural differences, and the way that we express emotions, the way that we perhaps hide some emotions, and there's slightly different meanings as well. And I think, honestly, I think that's something that we would have to look into to provide a better answer. Although the simplest way, again, is simple awareness and noting those pieces. And we call it calling in nowadays. So rather than call someone out in public, is just to call them in and say, hey, I noticed this was happening in the meeting. Is there something that I need to know? Or can you tell me more about your reaction to that? Or, just again, opening up the conversation, but in a safe space.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know I've done a little bit of international travel, and you can see some of those scenarios, especially in formal meetings, where it's, if you're not totally tuned in to local situation, local custom, they were tough to read, like incredibly tough to read.
If you think about it, sorry. Even in our own culture, we're hard to read. Okay. Yeah, I say, how are you? What are you going to say to me?
I'm fine.
There you go. Okay, now if you want the definition of fine, the Italian Job movie gives a perfect definition of fine. I mean, rarely are we fine. Rarely. And that answer is fantastic if we're passing each other by. Or, truly, if I don't think you care, I'm going to tell you I'm fine. But when somebody actually stops, like you were talking about before, that leadership conversation, I said, how are you doing with this? Yeah. I'm fine. I say no. I say there's something else. And we're holding back on an opportunity. If somebody asks that and stays and waits for the answer, own the answer.
So be careful what you're asking for in that situation, is what you're saying. Right?
Yeah. But and don't stop.
I'm not trying to be glib about it, but if you're truly asking to check in, Jenny, how are you doing?
Yeah.
Be invested and be prepared for the response. Right. I think that's really, it's interesting. So there's a lot, and sorry, I'm seeing lots of comments coming back here. Riva, I wanted to get back to something that you said. It's already scrolled away from me. Something about this space. Oh, would you call this bubble adaptive space or the space of possibilities? So I think maybe she was talking about the bubble in between what I knew would have been your finger puppets.
I don't have my finger puppets out next time. Watch out. Collaboration will have the finger puppets out. But yes, absolutely. I think there's a great term to put to it, especially that possibilities one.
Yeah. Another question from Mark. What would you say is the one best thing to say or do to introduce emotional intelligence? So I'm thinking maybe that's introduce that to a group, to your team, Mark.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I need time to think about that one. I actually like the question, how are you doing today? And making space for that answer. And listening, that's the other piece in this. You got to listen. You got to really want to listen. And that goes beyond the but starting there opens the conversation. And then, you know, if you're there as a leader, as Craig said, if you've got a new project, you've got a challenge, you need to hit some results, and that's going to require performance. How are you feeling about this challenge? Right? Actually, you know what? I have a parent who's in hospital, a kid at home, and I'm struggling. This is a real big challenge. Okay. But now we're at a place where we can work together for the support that we need to get to that challenge. So I think that's where I would start and where I would introduce them.
Yeah. And, you know, and I think we're going to especially see as we come out of this over the next few months, right? Before we hit record this morning, you and I were talking about workplaces that are returning, and we've chatted about this before, where, you know, your comment around, you know, you have a parent who has been used to give their kid a hug and a kiss goodbye every morning, that all of a sudden is suddenly going to change. What about the new puppy we just got, and now I got to be back in the, like, there's going to be all sorts of things mixed in. Never mind just with the, you know, some may have anxiety about, frankly, returning into the workplace. You know, there's the beliefs about whether we're opening too soon, too late. I'm not going there, but there's a lot tied up in that for folks. And, you know, as leaders, you're now, especially if you're in that middle layer of leadership, where you got the pressures from above, the pressures from the team returning. Your ability to really think about and listen to your team is going to be just so key. I get a little stressed out thinking about it, frankly,
and what we're talking about here is reality testing. We need to be really almost press a pause and make sure that we are doing that reality testing piece. If our emotions are flowing really strongly, we can blow that reality into something that it just completely isn't. And then that stress tolerance piece as well. Some people, one of the parts that we talk about in emotional intelligence is flexibility. And flexibility in the past 16 months and the next 10 months, actually, I think it's going to be a key skill moving forwards, is crucial to survival. But your flexibility, if you're super stress tolerant and super flexible, you got to be watching really carefully, because, you know, if I'm that and I work for you, you're going to have no idea. I'm just going to keep bending and shifting with whatever you throw at me. Mm-hmm. But how am I really doing under there? You won't see if I'm stressed, not unless you ask me.
Yeah. That just touches on something I think, Ron, in the chat here, you know, is there a time when dealing with emotions to get straight to the point of the issue? Sometimes people use emotions to avoid accountability. Okay,
that's a good way to look at it. And there's lots of people who, you know, do we need this emotion? This emotion gets in the way. So an interesting piece that we have in the no hard feelings that comes up in there a lot, we have relevant emotions and we have irrelevant emotions. So this is this self-awareness, this inside looking piece. So as I'm going through these, and our day is like a roller coaster. And actually, if you're a leader, you create a lot of that roller coaster as well. So we've got those two things working together. But it's being aware of what's relevant here, what's irrelevant. So if I've heard something and I have a younger brother who's an absolute genius. And when we were little, we used to play games, board games, and I would always lose. And hands up, I was that kid that threw the board in the air, had enough of that. But that creates an emotional memory. Okay. So now we're at work, we're in a discussion, and somebody says something and I suddenly feel little. And inside, I'm going right back, because that's what our amygdala that fires all this emotional memory does. I'm going right back to when I was 7 years old. Yeah. That's not relevant here. This is the joy of being a grown-up. I don't have to live in that space anymore. I get to be present right here. So that's irrelevant. I got to push that one to the side. That's not useful in this situation. And so, you know, a lot of what we do at work, people say, well, we've just got to get to the task. We've got to get to these results. Yeah. And yes, we do. But remember, results are created by performance, and people drive the performance. So whilst I'm all for leaning on the task, I think we still have to acknowledge that there is an emotional piece within this.
Yeah, holy crap, there's a lot there.
Oh.
So yeah, and it's interesting because the one thing you and I were also talking about before we got on this topic was, my entire career has been in sales and marketing roles, right? And it's this, this balance of needing results. You've got to get the results, got to come, right? So, where's the time in the day for dealing with emotions, right? I'm sorry you're not feeling good, or I'm sorry things aren't going well. That's great. I'm trying to help, but it still doesn't change the fact that we've got to get this number, right?
Yeah.
And that I think is where I sometimes struggled with this in the past, is that, in those roles, you are so singularly focused on, you've got to get to the result, right? And how do you then create that space for yourself, for your team to be able to go through that? That's a struggle, right?
It is a struggle. And there's a couple of things I think that we can use as flags for ourselves. and the first off, we're all different. And so, someone, if we did a personality test, okay, I would come out sort of as that people person. It's all about the people. And then somebody else would come out, no, it's all about the details and get it done. And this is a race. We've got to hit that piece within there. So we're going to approach those two situations really, really differently. And so that piece comes back to know yourself. And so if you are a get it done, reach the number, this is the way we're going, then perhaps it's a few cues to remind yourself the conversation starts with, Jenny, how are you today? Now, if you're working with someone else who's a similar mind, maybe you don't do that bit. Maybe you dive right in there. But you can put a boundary on that, Jenny, how are you today? You don't have to give me an hour. You give me an hour, I'll talk for an hour. My family will tell you that. But if you close it in, we've still got that piece where now we're connected. And the other piece in there too is, keep a check on your emotional intensity, because the pressure comes this way, but we're dealing with a team who's going to achieve those results for you. Is your emotional intensity matching the situation? And so, what we tend to do, because we're not very good at living in that present moment with the emotion, is that we just let them stack up. And then all of a sudden there's one question that perhaps you're like, of course you know the answer to that. And your emotional intensity's gone up and the damage is done. And it doesn't match the situation, which is why we need to be in check with this as we go through the day.
You're managing your emotional intensity. That one just triggered something for me there, is that, so what if my emotional intensity is at a level and I don't think other people are matching the same level of intensity? Like, I think they should be at my level of emotional intensity. Don't you know this is important? Why aren't you here with me? How can you be down here when I'm here? You
just hit a magic word that I talk about all the time. I think you should be at the same level as me.
Ooh, look at that. I stepped in it, didn't I?
And people, there's got to be some of you in the audience who've heard me say this before. Don't shit on me, because that's really, really rude.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure my wife just about yelled it from the next room.
So, but it's a really key piece, because that's you. And why on earth aren't I coming with you? Because I'm me, and I don't see it that way. And why would I? Unless we've got that connection and we're having that conversation. And actually what we're pulling that away from now is not about emotional intensity. It's actually about sort of cohesing around that goal that we're trying to achieve. And so when we talk about collaboration, a couple of weeks here, we're going to talk about the pieces that lead to great collaboration. And one of those in there is, I've got you back. In fact, my job is to make you look brilliant. And you're going to find it really hard to make me look brilliant if you're like, why aren't you at the same level as me here? You don't care. There's no way that those two are going to go together really well. So we're right back to it. Know your people. Know what makes them tick.
Well, and sorry, when you talk about making brilliant, folks, if you've never read this one, fantastic read. It's all about the concept of, are you a genius maker for your team? In sales, we sometimes talk about it being the hero maker or playing the hero for your team. And so Anyway, I love that's Multipliers is a fantastic read if you've never read it. There are a number of questions here. Sorry, they've just been popping in. We've kind of, I got wrapped up in the last couple minutes. So Simon, good to see you from WestJet this morning, Simon. But I like the way he's phrased this question, a bit Machiavellian maybe, but can emotion be used as a tool for leaders? As a leader, what are the positive ways that you can use emotion with your team?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a really good piece, because we talk about unpleasant a lot. We don't talk about pleasant. You can numerous ways. A lot of emotional intelligence comes in the recognition that we give people. And, here's an interesting piece. So Craig, you have leaders underneath you, and then you have a team underneath that. And so the leaders underneath you praise their team, but is the leader above using that recognition as well? Okay, so if I sit at the bottom and you say to me, Jenny, heard this feedback, I thought this was excellent, and here's why. Okay, you just made my day. I might struggle to take that. Some people do. You might just get, oh, thanks. But I walk away feeling richer, feeling seen, feeling valued, possibly feeling inspired. Guess what that does to my engagement and my satisfaction in the job? That's kind of cool. The other piece where leaders can use this emotion is personal power. And so I'm going to flip back to the unpleasant, because I think it's a strong example. But when we talk about assertiveness, Craig, if you say to me, Jenny, I see X, Y, and Z has happened, and I'm really disappointed, and I'd like to have a conversation around that. Now, what you've done in that sentence is owned how you feel about it. And I picked disappointed because that's one that I would have a reaction to that. Now we're talking about emotional memory again. I'm going right back to when I was a small person. Like, I don't want to disappoint you. You didn't tell me how to feel. You didn't tell me you simply owned it. And now I'm like, oh, okay, we gotta have a conversation about this. You didn't project any of that on me. And there was certainly no sort of blame or anything else in there. It was just opening that door. This is really tough.
Simon, hope that helped. Brad has an interesting question here. It kind of goes back to this emotional intensity we're talking about. How does one deal with a report whose emotional intensity is always at a very high level, arguably too high?
We've got an interesting piece going on at the moment too, with where we are in pandemic. So we have to remember that people are starting their day. Yeah. I think the neuro leadership in the States ranked us with 3 levels. And when there's no pandemic in the mix, we all start the level at day one, start the day at level 1. And it would take something to move us to level 2. And for most of us, you're talking about rage mode to hit level 3. It depends on the person. What they're seeing now and globally is that we're starting the day at level 2. So emotional intensity is much, much higher straight off. So we have to be aware of that. We don't know people's stories. Yeah. The other piece, though, if we're talking sort of outside of that, is why is that emotional intensity so high? And you really got to know your people. I'm going to come back to acknowledge and ask a question. And I'm also wondering sometimes it's a plea to be heard, and it's a plea to be understood. And so, perhaps we're looking at a team dynamic around there. It may have been the way that person's been taught. That was the only way to ever get attention. When we look at drama, which is generally what emotional intensity is made up of, those 3, we either create it, we invite it, or we accept it and play a part in it. And we don't have to do that piece. Yeah. And we need about a day to unpack the rest of that question. Yeah,
I know. I'm just thinking about your comment there about creating, inviting drama. That, it's for me as a leader, it's always interesting to sometimes look back and see those moments where you inadvertently perhaps created drama, right? Yeah. Or you never meant to. And sometimes those can be really tough situations to unwind. Again, perhaps a conversation for another time. Jen's got an interesting question here too, because it ties into your comment around acknowledging and asking. But what strategy would you suggest if you acknowledge and ask questions, the other person chooses not to engage in the conversation or acknowledge their emotions, but their emotions continue to negatively impact the workplace?
So in a lot of cases, the armor will go up. I mean, let's face it, we've been taught for years to stifle stuff, not show them, and definitely not talk about them. So for some people, this is really hard. Sometimes it's about changing the conversation. So if you feel that you've done that attempt 2-3 times and it's not working, they're not hearing. So change the way that you're approaching that. And sometimes that can be in intent and impact. So their intent might not actually be to create toxic workplace. It's the impact. And so that may be a way to approach that conversation. When we're talking about the workplace, if it's creating a toxic culture, I'm going to go back to, and this is tough to say, but are they in the right job? And are they being asked to do something? Are they working from their strengths? Because it's quite difficult to be toxic if you're actually working from a strength set, because you pretty much will like what you're doing. So there's a lot of pieces within there. It's difficult to answer.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think sometimes you want to shy away from that job fit question. Like, roles are going to change over time. Organizations and teams are going to change, and at some point, there are going to be situations where you as the leader may just not fit anymore, or people on your team may just not fit anymore. And so you may not always be able to get there. There's lots more questions here, Jenny. We're clearly onto something this morning. Lisa, you've touched on one here I think that we need to address, and is that, do you have some suggestions on how we deal with the gender bias that is sometimes attached to emotion at work?
Yes, because if I cry in a conversation, I am whatever labels you want to put on there. And if you cry in a conversation, that's completely different, isn't it? And that whole, if I raise my voice with that emotional intensity, now there's a whole load of bossy and other B words coming to us, whereas you are assertive. So gender does play in this part. And gender really plays in this part when you have emotionally immature intelligence happening around us. And so I think we're gaining ground with the more times we have this conversation. My colleagues and I are out there in organizations all the time having this conversation, which, let's be fair, is usually at least a 2-day conversation, not an hour or 45 minutes, whatever we have here now. Yeah. So as a female, it's owning it. Like, one of our daughters said to me, I hate it when I cry in emotional conversations. And like, for goodness sake, since the day you've been born, crying has shown us that you're alive. It's shown us that you care. And if somebody's in that situation, that's a passion piece. And if I'm running a team, I can't think of anything better than people who care about the work they're doing. Let's celebrate that piece. To go back to the original question, wherever you fit in that gender piece, I think it's just awareness. And I think if you have the confidence to own that piece, we might need to help other people. And so, let's go back to that crying in a conversation. If there's tissues in the meeting room, or Kleenex, whatever I'm supposed to call them here, okay, grab one, use it. If your intensity's gone right up, leave. Okay, we calm down when we're alone a little bit quicker. If we're in a one-on-one, it's, Jenny, do you need some time? Nope, I'm fine. I'm okay. It's going to take me a couple minutes to get a sentence out straight, but I am okay. This is normal. All right, let's be there.
Yeah.
Hard to do. Easy to say, hard to do.
Absolutely. And again, it's that piece of, I think sometimes as a leader, you feel like you should just act like you have the answer figured out, versus pausing and sharing with whomever you're speaking with, going, I got some emotion going on right now. I'm not quite sure how to address in this conversation, right? I may need a moment. It's okay as a leader to sometimes step back, but I think, at least in my experience, you don't want to do that, because all of a sudden it looks like perhaps a sign of weakness, or if you don't know the answer, how am I supposed to ever know the answer, right? And so it's interesting to to unpack that one. And yes, Riva, definitely gender bias could be a future topic for sure. Allison, yes, humbleness, totally agree. You know, I think we've all, or some of us at times, have worked for leaders that perhaps lack that, and becomes a really interesting dynamic. I think we're going to got time for maybe one or two more questions before we wrap up here. David has a question here about, how do you open up a crowd of introverts? Almost everyone on my team are quiet, introverted people. Very hard to get them talking about how they feel.
It's a gift in terms of, you know, we often think, oh, introverts are not going to talk up. Of course they're going to talk up. Especially if you're extroverted, you're going to paint a picture that probably isn't true. Are you going to be able to wade straight into that sort of gritty, tough conversation? Maybe not. My first suggestion, because we're a little bit time slapped here, is, you know, build the relationship. Build the one-on-one relationship, and remember, group conversations are exhausting, necessary but exhausting. What can you do to help people prepare beforehand? Don't dump the emotional conversation or the tough conversation with no warning. That's not fair. And actually, truly, that's not really fair on any end of that continuum either. The other piece would be how you manage that meeting with that group. And so there's an awful lot of creating space for voice and how you're going to do that. And we might lean into that a bit on the 23rd as well with collaboration, because we need all those voices in there.
Yeah. And, you know, and some of the comments in the chat, because I've seen psychological safety, great teamwork. All of these intelligences that you need to have as a leader are just so linked. Like it's impossible to really just talk about emotional intelligence in a bubble of its own, right? It's just, it all feeds into each other. So, but in the fullness of time, I know we've got a number of questions still sitting here in the Q&A. We will make sure we answer those in the follow-up material that comes out. In the chat, there's been some fantastic conversation there. But we do like to try and end off with, you know, a big idea, a couple strategies, and 3 questions for you to think about. So, Jenny, maybe we'll move on to that and get folks out of here so they can go watch the parade.
Let's see if we can find it. This should take us. There we go. One big idea. And as Craig said, I will answer all the questions that are sitting there. If they're in the chat, we can't see them after the webinar is finished. So please make sure those questions go into.
The only pause I'll put on that is I did copy and paste the chat out already. So
awesome, because I haven't seen it. So I'd love to see that piece. All right. One big idea is when you're thinking about your emotional culture within your team, it's coming from you. So do you know what the emotional norms are? Those are the unwritten pieces. So if in your meeting somebody slams a hand on the desk, that is an emotional norm if it's tolerated. Another emotional, rolling eyes might be an emotional norm. Saying hello in the corridor might be an emotional norm. Gratitude, all those pieces. What are they? Do you know them? And if you're a leader, you're modeling them. So what are you modeling amongst your team? The general rule of thumb is we want a healthy emotional expression, some degree of that. And we can talk about what's relevant, what's not relevant, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. That's what we call boundaries. It is perfectly acceptable to be frustrated. It is not acceptable to yell at your colleague, for example. Emotional labor is a piece from that No Hard Feelings book. And it's a really interesting one. And it's hard to be aware of. It's a great question to ask your team. But we spend, or some people spend, a lot of time acting. And that's a complete waste of energy. But, Craig, if I'm saying, oh, yeah, your idea is brilliant, that's so cool, and I don't mean it, it's a complete waste of energy and our time. But people will do it for that safety piece. And we talked about gender here. Ladies, heads up, we're awful for doing that. So pay attention. And then we promised 2 strategies as well. So the first one, we talked about this a little bit. Your emotions are contagious. And that's okay, because we're in charge. So if somebody else is in that unpleasant state, you don't have to own that. The only time we want to take it away is when it's that excited, that happy, that joy piece. if you're in that situation where someone else is going through it, just step back, physically step back, or in your mind, step back. If you label your own emotion, it sort of drops it. It reduces the intensity. And breathing's always good, funny that. But oxygen helps us to clear the brain a little bit. So we can now listen, what's going on for them? What are the cues? And then when you're ready, if it's safe, acknowledge and ask a question. Okay, they may put the wall up, that's okay, but we can acknowledge and ask a question. Second strategy to be aware of is, and we've said this numerous times, it starts with ourselves. So how do we look at ourselves? Do we have that emotional literacy? We'll put a list of some of the emotions in our resource pack. What's our emotional expression? Okay, do I say nothing? You know, you can tell from the accent, I grew up in England, we're kind of taught. Okay, I can't do a poker face, but that's what we're taught, stiff upper lip and all that. Is that really helpful? So know yourself. If your emotional literacy is mad, sad, glad, there's an app for that. And I'm not joking, it's an excellent app. It's called Mood Meter, and it will help you expand that piece. Absolutely free, and it's on all platforms. And then
more accurate than my mood ring.
And Craig, I'm sorry I had to throw it in here, but you know, come and join us. We have some brilliant facilitators in this space, and some great courses for leaders, for people, the whole way. We can do it sort of small group, big group, everything. And then here's our 3 questions to take it away. And these are for you. Pick one that you like and run with it for a week and see how that works. Perfect. That's us.
Excellent. And as Jenny says, yes, we can do this for you. We can do this for your team. We can help you out. In fact, that's what we're here for. SAIT Corporate Training is happy to work with your organization to help upskill and reskill your team. So please do, if there's something that's resonating here, do not hesitate to reach out and see if there's ways that we can work together. In 2 weeks, speaking of working together, that was a good unintentional segue.
Very good.
But collaboration is what we'll be back on. So look forward to seeing everybody in a couple of weeks, whether you're stampeding at home or stampeding at Stampede, or if you are still with us from South Africa, thank you. I'm sure you're not stampeding over there, but enjoy your evening that's coming up. And with that, everybody, please have a great day. It was good to see you.
Thanks. Take care. Be safe.